This video is a doozy. I'm not gonna lie, it is gonna be dry in some parts, but I believe that on the whole it'll be more beneficial than it will be dry. So I've been working on it for a long time. It's a video that I've been alluding to for ages, and it's about how to conduct research in Logseq, and that's either with the literature survey or just the process of knowledge synthesis. If you're new to Logseq, this is probably not going to be the best video to start with. Although, having said that, it might entice you to stick with the program when you see what's possible, but there's going to be a lot that will probably go over your head because it assumes quite a good foundational knowledge of Logseq. If you're interested in learning more about Logseq, skip ahead to the end of the video. I'll talk a little bit about the course that I have on Logseq. It might still be a good video to go through anyways though, because I've put a lot of work into structuring a nice outline that will hopefully make sense to a lot of users and provide value to users who are not even familiar with Logseq. So that's all I really have to say before we dive in. I hope you find it useful, and yeah, see you on the other side. So what we're going to go through today, a quick introduction. We're going to have a look at the overview of the research process from start to finish, a high-level ontology for research, so what are the different structures that you can add in your database, how you actually do that in Logseq, then some additional points for consideration, how we can apply some of these thoughts on ontologies in different contexts, and then we're going to just quickly go through some additional references and tools, and then we'll wrap it up. So I'm going to start off with something a little bit different, which is my introduction, and it's going to be looking at a song. Now, you can't play the song, but you can go find it on Spotify if you so choose. It's called Know Your Bones by A. King, and there's some great quotes in here, or great lyrics that I want to make reference to. And the first one there is, "Glorious mistakes are anxiously waiting to be made." I feel like I should almost sing it, but I'm not going to. The point about that is that I'm not a researcher. I have just been interested in how one can apply Logseq in a research context, and frankly, it's a very interesting problem, how you structure your work, and it's got applications in many different areas. So whenever I make a mistake, it is mine and is not as a result of any of the people that I've spoken to, so I will take ownership for that. And then the second point there is like, I'm not young enough to know everything. Yeah, I got into singing. Basically, again, to the same point, like I have not tested the system at large. What I have done is I've gone through my old thesis and I've applied some of the principles here, and I've also done a few new papers and I've tested those frameworks to make sure that they are scalable and that they work quite well, but I haven't actually taken it to its full fruition. I haven't written papers in Logseq, etc. So again, take it with a pinch of salt. And then a song is never finished, only abandoned. And that's really with relation to this video and the content or the concept of doing knowledge synthesis and research in Logseq. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and I'll speak to that a little bit in the latter stages of the video, but it's important to note that things will continually evolve, so make sure that whatever you're doing, it's flexible. We're not going to talk about source management in this video. I'm not an expert on that. Whatever you do though, I would say do it consistently. If you're using Zotero, use Zotero consistently. If you're using your PDFs in Logseq, make sure that you're uploading them consistently and naming them consistently, adding metadata consistently, all of that. And then finally, I'm also not going to talk much about the writing process and referencing. I will make some notes on that though. So that's where we're going. The main focus is really going to be on this literature survey and knowledge synthesis components. Before I go and break down the process from my perspective, I also want to say that this is heavily influenced by Joel Chan's model over here, and I'll provide links to this below. I also had a discussion with Joel, and yeah, it's shaped the way that I've structured the work and how I'm thinking about it. So yeah, what I've done though is I've transposed this a little bit to the left here. And it all starts with a question. So let's quickly go back to Logseq, and then I'll come back to this diagram. So we start with a question, and ideally it's great to be led by your curiosity. The idea is then we need to go and find out what is known and unknown about the problem. And this is where we go and actually look at the literature and find what we can in the literature. So that is figuring out, why is this important? What needs to be researched more? What is the best approaches? Also, what has been done before? So yeah, we'll have a look at that in the second point, but that's like the broad perspective of like why you're going to the literature. Now, why Logseq is beneficial in this is because it allows you to do a very fluid approach of, I have a question and then I go and read about the question, and then I'm reading in this PDF and I can link to that question and I can say, oh, okay, but that prompts another question. Where do I put that? I can just quickly put that here. So it allows for a very fluid approach, and also allows you to link the different parts of this workflow together, and that's a super important component. The second point there is understanding the state of knowledge and identifying the gaps. So the literature survey is really about seeing the state of the art, or establishing the state of the art. Like in this field, what is the current status quo, or what is accepted in this field? And you're reading a bunch of papers to inform your research questions, or figure out an approach to how you might develop that state of the art, or push it forward, or challenge it maybe. Now, I just want to make a comment here that as an undergraduate, this might be a bit more targeted. And I know this was the case in my situation, where the professor had given us topics and then we had to go, and it was a very convergent approach in the sense that I wasn't diverging and asking a lot of questions. Although even in that space, retrospectively, when I was working on it in Logseq, I realized there would have been tremendous benefits if I had taken a step back and actually asked the questions in a specific way to structure my work, so that I could see, what the best approach would be in that. So it might not necessarily be about like finding the best research question, but it's about finding like what is the best approach to tackle that question. It might need to be a bit more specific. Moving on to knowledge synthesis, that's where you construct an understanding, and you also develop a baseline that you can work from going forwards. So from the evidence, or from the papers that I've been reading, what is the synthesized knowledge for this to help me move that forward, or move a question forward, for instance. So it's really like the hard work of this part of research. It's about taking all the different pieces of information and putting it in together into a coherent whole. Now, the benefits of Logseq in this area is the PDF annotation, which is a huge win, and then the block-based writing. And it allows you to do all of this in one place and to structure your work. And there's many different ways of doing that, but you can use backlinks, page properties. All of this just allows you to find the information that you need, and also find the context from where that information was sourced. So we're going to look at this a little bit later. I realize that it might be a little bit convoluted at first, but this is just the process. The next part of the process is hypothesis formation. And this isn't a linear process. It's not like I have a hypothesis and then I go and do the papers and I can do the test and there I run away. No, if I read a source, it might change how I'm thinking about this, or like change the way that I believe that this experiment will run in the world. And the whole process inevitably generates more questions. So reading generates more questions, and it's about finding that like way through the fogginess of the initial reading to say, okay, cool, this is something worth pursuing. Now, the graph database allows you to keep track of those questions all in one place, and also work in multiple places at the same time. It's not multitasking, it's just having different contexts open and being able to access those contexts very easily. Maybe it is multitasking, I don't know. Then the parts which we're not going to look at, well, we're not going to look at this hypothesis formation part, but typically in the research process, you design an experiment, you then collect and analyze that data, you then synthesize your findings, and write a research report. So I'm really going to be focusing on these two parts up here, which are the knowledge synthesis parts. So I'm going to go back to the diagram now, which is here. So we start with a set of questions, or a question, which then like breathes out, and then I go and I find sources. Now you can use Research Rabbits, elicit.org, and that then gives you a PDF. So there is my sources. I take my questions to my sources, and then I start taking snippets of information from them, and I classify those as observations. What was a claim? What was evidence? And we're going to look at this a little bit more. And as you see here, this little line goes and informs / generates more questions, which then I take back to my sources, or I interlink those with other questions. It's all this iterative nonlinear environment. Now, the synthesis part of that is where you take your observations and see how those different ideas compose together. Does this support this? Does this oppose this? Like, how does this what are the relationships between those things? Another thing here is that your syntheses can again inform your questions, that little line going up there. And that's just this whole discovery process. It's really like that diverge, converge, diverge, converge. There's the design thinking framework as well. It's all about diverging and converging. I'll add a link to that below, but it's not relevant necessarily for here. And ideally, you want to then compose these syntheses, these higher levels of abstraction with each other. So the syntheses are taking your observations and they are making them units of knowledge in a sense, and then you want to compose those things together. So this is the exact same model that Joel's putting forward here, but I've just translated it to be this left to right, top to bottom, because that works a little bit better in my understanding. We're now going to look at a high-level ontology for research, and yeah, this is universal. It's not specific to Logseq. It's just a way to think about structuring your work so that it's beneficial for you in the long run. Why is structure important? This is something which Joel said to me, which is the iron rule of science is that we arbitrate between competing claims by seeing what the world feeds back to us. So we should be comparing and contrasting claims to evaluate arguments or generate this original knowledge. Now, this requires the connection of different conclusions, premises, etc., in order to be able to evaluate them. And this is where that linking becomes very useful. You also want to be able to separate what the author of a paper is saying and what the evidence in that paper is that they're presenting. And we're going to get a little bit into that now, but that's an important distinction to make up front. Another thing about structuring is that it helps you develop a language for yourself that scales in your knowledge management process. Now, the other thing about this is that it can potentially make it more accessible to others. The challenge here is that we're then moving into collective knowledge management, which is another thing altogether where you have to then agree on terms and agree on like ways of working and how different things are classified, and that's a separate kettle of fish. At the moment we are focusing more on the individual, but if you have this structure up front or this ontology up front, it might help you at a later point when you need to interface with other people. On the other hand, if you work in a research group and you all have the same ontology and you are working from this point of departure, it can be very, very helpful to just streamline your whole process. And then the last point here is just a helpful framework by which to organize your work. Otherwise, you're just flaying around and working in like text notes, and it's all good and you can find those things later by search, but that upfront structuring really helps you to just organize your mind. So a basic format for this structure is, I wonder about X. Again, I start with a question in my mind, as we saw in that diagram. With that question in mind, I do an experiment and I see Y. So then I have an observation of something that I'm seeing in the world, or you could call it evidence, but we'll get there a little bit later. And that leads me to deduce Z, which is this claim. So at the highest level, I have questions, observations, and claims. Now, observations, as I say, I interchange it with evidence in this video, and we'll get there when we look at observations. So questions encourage the Socratic process by which you're trying to figure out the real source of the problem. So why is this the case? Okay, cool. This is the explanation for that. Okay, why is that the case? And then again, you go down to the base level, like the root cause of what is the problem or what is the area that you're interested in. Now, you can do this in your own life. I mean, in therapeutic context, you'll find people ask why. It's a helpful exercise. Again, very helpful here. Now, your questions can also be broken down into a tree. So I have a high-level question. It's okay, cool. But that high-level question breaks down into 4 different levels of questions or 4 separate questions. And then I could even break those down a bit further because it really helps me to figure out the detail of the problem. So now we're getting into observations, and observations can be presented as evidence or results. And this is about defining what works for you. Evidence, when considering it in the case of literature survey or your research process initially, comes from a source. So it's not from an experiment in this case, but later down the line you'll have results from your experiments. And it's important to note that that source has a context. It has an author, obviously, but authors have their biases, etc. Important context there. A type of study. Is it a randomized controlled trial? Is it a meta-study? Who are the participants? What is the population? Age, gender, all these things have a role. What is the methodology that they used, or what were the different measures? And then what was the intervention that was trialed? So all of those little points below provide a very important context to the evidence. And something which Joel said here is that your observation should be in the past tense and add as much detail as possible. So instead of people produce, which is very generic, it's important to say these people, i.e. these people in that context, produced this given that context. So the claim is not super generalizable, and you'll see this, there's a mismatch with this everywhere really, where people will make very high level statements about, oh, this is the way that the world works because of this one experiment. And it's like, no, in that context, with that intervention, in that very controlled environment, that is what happened. And now it's important to look at claims. So a claim is a generalizable, declarative statement about something which is believed to be true. It's not a statement of truth. And this is where I think people go wrong, where they make statements of truth. I'm not going to go into that point there because I think it might be a bit confusing, but they are informed by your observations or supported by evidence or results. Now, that's why it's important to make sure that your claims are grounded in context. The other thing about this is that your claims can be opposed by other claims or supported by other claims or contrast, or there's an active verb there, like of what is the relationship between these different things. And this is where you need to distinguish and clarify claims. Like, your job is to say, not just take what the author is presenting as a conclusion and be like, this is a statement of fact. You need to take it and see and pass it out for the evidence and the claim. And here, testing the claims of others, don't just trust someone else's claims. Look at their research, look at their evidence, and then try and track the acceptance or rejection of claims based on their evidence and based on other claims, etc. So it's all about really understanding deeply what the flow of information is there in all the different relationships. It's not an easy task. When I went back and looked at my literature review for my thesis, I realized like how messy it was, and yeah, I wish I'd known. Well, I guess you always want to have known more when we were younger, but alas, such is life. Now, just a point here, if I close, oopsie, there and there, the final point here is differentiating between source claims and your own claims. My initial draw was to be able to differentiate between my claims and the claims of others, but when I spoke to Joel about this, his perspective was that you're entering the conversation, particularly if you're in a combined graph, which we're not looking at in this case, but you're entering the conversation, you want to be able, you don't necessarily need to add that differentiation of this is mine and this is someone else's. You could use properties to do that. Again, it really is up to you. There's so many ways to do this. This is just like the high level approaches. Okay, so synthesis. The core task of synthesis is reducing this burden of extracting trapped data in PDF environments. So it's where you construct this understanding of what is worth pursuing based on these different claims and evidence that you are being presented with. And it really is the hard work of research. It's not just taking statements at face value, it's applying them in different contexts. Now, there's also multiple levels of synthesis. So at the first level, I could synthesize the claims being made by one author, or I could, in a very specific narrow band between a couple of different papers. But then at the next level of synthesis, there's level 1 there for a single piece of evidence or a handful of pieces of evidence. But then level 2 is for multiple pieces of evidence or claims or across multiple lower levels. So if I have like this one area, I'm like, okay, cool, how does that actually relate to this area? And then I need to synthesize them and add that high level of abstraction. So outputs of this might be, an introduction to the paper that you're writing, an essay maybe, or proposal. That's like really like the hardcore work there, where it's like not just taking that low level of synthesis and being like, this is what is happening in the world. It's saying, cool, and what is that, and why is that important in this research context? There's also some aggregation of claims there, actually at both levels, but you want to be able to really, like, as I say, compare and contrast between those claims. So what's the difference between claims and evidence? This is, again, I've alluded to it above, but just to add a little bit more depth here, this was something that Joel and I chatted about because I didn't understand it, and I was like, how does this work? And evidence is the result of observing something occurring in the world. So I did something. I did an experiment, I observed an interaction. Usually there's an instrument or some form of record. Evidence also has context. It's got instruments, methods, participants. So typically, if you're thinking about like the way that a paper is structured, it would be what would be found in the results section of a paper. So something, just a little word of advice maybe, is find the papers that are aiming to be as evidence-based as possible and isolate the effect. Like, what is the independent variable that we're testing, and how are we sure that we've been able to collect the data or present the data in such a way that it's not biased by the author shaping the narrative with their claims. So the claim is ontologically different to the evidence. So again, it's a generalizable statement that can be made on the basis of these observations. Now, it's either supported or opposed by evidence, and it's what typically would be found in the discussion part of the paper. Ideally, you don't want it to be biased by the author's narratives or whatever, but it might be the case. But it's the author's, I guess, synthesis of what they are seeing. But it's still a claim when you are bringing it into your world. Now we're getting into the meat of this video, how you go about structuring your work in Logseq. Now, it's really all a mapping exercise. It's about saying, these are the different entities, and this is how they relate to one another. And the way that I'm presenting this might not work for you, and you might want to define your own ontology, but I'm presenting this just as a point of departure. And maybe there's a bit of an exhortation here to think about blocks, pages, how you might use block properties, page properties, and how you can get them all to work together in the way that you need. This is a way that has proved effective for me in my context of going back and looking through my thesis and rewriting some sections, and also looking at a couple of papers, but it's important to caveat that this might not work for you. The typical point of departure I would recommend is to first create a high-level project page. So that's a place where you can then go and put your questions. But those questions, I would also put those in backlinks so that it creates a node. So it creates a page around your full question. And that's important because that enables you to point to that node at a later stage. So you don't have to necessarily go and write in that question itself, but then you can refer back to that node in multiple different locations. For observations or evidence, again, in this literature research phase, not in where I'm writing up my own report, I would put that in the source page. So with Logseq, I can upload a PDF, and then I can annotate that PDF, so make highlights, do all the fancy things there, and that will give me an annotations page, which typically has that HLS prefix over there. And I can then denote what the different evidence is that the author is presenting. Again, I can use I can put the whole thing in a note, or I could just say hashtag evidence or something like that. Again, that's getting a little bit more into personal preference. I've been using it as like a full note. Evidence, this is the number of people that did this or whatever. And your claims can go anywhere really. So your claims might be written in your high-level project page, or you could have claims written by the author in those source pages, and that could be like a helpful way for you to differentiate. Again, that's a bit more of an open thing, and yeah, there's no hard and fast rule there. It really is a matter of feeling it out. Synthesis is a bit of a different question. On level 1, you might want to do this inside a question page. So not at your high-level project page, but if you have like a broad question, you could say, okay, cool, I'm going to go into that question page now. So not pointing to the node, actually going into the node and saying, this is my understanding of this topic based on these multiple pieces of evidence that I'm collecting. The second level of synthesis, that one that we spoke about, like a higher level synthesis, you could maybe do that in the high-level project page, but you could also create MOC pages or Zettelkasten pages where you're putting together bigger units of information. So maybe you have like theme pages within an area of research. That would be a good approach to like synthesize multiple levels of question. Now, a point to remember here is that when you're using blocks, the beauty is that you can always click into that block if it's referenced particularly and go and see the context of where you're finding that from. So you never lose that context in this like stage of creating those links. And that's really, really useful when you are working in Logseq. Another important thing to take note of is adding relationship syntax. So, you know, how do these different pieces of information relate to one another? So evidence has a source, and that source is usually defined by its appearance in that source page. As I said, I typically leave evidence in the source page. But then evidence supports your claims or opposes your claims. It can also inform a question. So these are all the verbs / adjectives, because these last two aren't really verbs. But it might be like consistent with or inconsistent with other evidence. And this is adding more meaning to these different pieces of information. So it's not just evidence, claim. It's like this claim is opposed by this evidence. If we look at claims, again, it's supported by evidence or other claims, or opposes evidence or other claims. And you can add many more things here, but it's helpful to think about these upfront so that you have a way of working in Logseq that is consistent. And then questions, informed by claims, informed by evidence, informed by synthesis, supports other questions. Again, there's a few things that I can put there. So some general tips on structuring. Adding these letters Q, C, and E in front of your questions or claims or evidence are very helpful to retrieve pieces of information at a later stage, because you can use autocomplete when you are typing in Logseq and I want to bring up a block. So I say Control K and then I say Q, and then there we go. These aren't my Zettelkasten claims, but I'm just interested to see what is coming up here. Yeah, that's safe. If you don't know where to start from your questions and then reconfigure later if necessary. Often starting is just the biggest hurdle. So you just need to get your questions out there and start working, and you can always reshuffle later. That's the beauty of these blocks. You can drag and drop them. And I can open this block up here in the right panel and just drag this block across underneath there, and bam, it'll appear there. There's a lot of magic working behind the scenes. So don't worry about losing information. Just as long as you have either tags for searching, or you can use full text search or query text. There's lots of ways to retrieve information, but just start on your question pages. That's, I think, what I'm getting to there. Okay. Another tip is using block embeds and page embeds. So this helps you see the same information in multiple different places. It's like a block reference, although it's embedded there, so it means you can actually edit it in line as well. And you can do this with both pages and blocks, which is super useful. And it helps you just see the same information in other places. The context that I'm thinking about it here is a document index. So I create a single document index in my high-level project page, and I can reference different parts of that document index at a later stage in different question pages. As I say, there's no right way of doing anything. It's really up to you, but I found these to be quite beneficial. Another point there is using markdown headings and line breaks to create space visually. I mean, that's what I've done in these videos here, where I have this is markdown heading level 2, and it automatically comes with an underlined thing over there. But I can also add a line break just by saying dash 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 enter, and that just creates a little bit of visual space so that you can separate your thinking. This last point here is not really related to a specific individual project. As if you have multiple projects or like different areas that you're interested in, you can use namespace hierarchy to give you some structure over there, or you can also use properties, page properties, to better define your different areas. The next point here is creating an overall index. So you can call this your Zettelkasten, but that's basically you are defining where your knowledge lives. So it might not be that you're working in a specific project. Maybe it's a theme, and then you start writing different notes within that theme page. This could be your project page, it could be your home project page. It also could just be, separate pages that you create. So that's a little bit more sort of big picture, like how you actually want to structure it. As I've said in other videos, I have my 5 high-level areas that I'm writing in, and that is applied thought, personal well-being, organizations, social issues, and what's the other one? Transcendence. So those are my 5 areas that I'm writing in, and when I write synthesis from the other notes, I will start writing it all in that single page. So that's basically my Zettelkasten. So a brief note on the PDF annotation. There's other videos on this. You can go have a look at it. But it's very helpful to use the highlighter to extract statements. And you can also do snippets. If there's a picture, for instance, you can get a screenshot of that using the inbuilt feature in Logseq. You don't have to do like a Control-Shift-S or whatever you're using on Windows. And that's very, very useful. If you want to, you also have the ability to do different highlighting colors in Logseq. Now, it's not something that I've investigated, but maybe you have something which is like, I oppose this, and you want to say, I'm going to highlight that in red, or the author said something very good, and you want to use it as a quote, and you say, highlight that in green. It's just a visual way to add a little bit more separation between things. I haven't defined that, but it's available to go and look at. You can also do full text search in Logseq. That means you can do your full PDF text in Logseq, which is a huge win. It's a recent development and very useful for researchers, I imagine. So let's go have a look at this on Excalidraw. I'm not going to have a look at it in Logseq because it gets a little bit messy. So these points here will be available in the Excalidraw file if you want them. I'm not going to go through them too much here. But as I say, I create a project page as a high-level point of departure. So I'll just call it high-level project page. Now I've added an alias there so that it's easy to find. You can also add tags there. So like for this video, for instance, it's how to conduct a research workflow in Logseq or whatever. I never ever went and found that. I just had a tag research workflow, and then the tag would bring it up or bring up some research workflow stuff, because I was actually using it whenever I was doing research for this video. But then I'd easily be able to find this video because it was tagged with that. So yeah, that's just a trick. Aliases are also very useful in that. So I could have made alias research workflow to point to this current file that I'm in. Very helpful just to find information easier, because that's one of the challenges with Logseq. If you're coming in new, you don't know where to find information. I've indicated here this breakdown here. So I've added some project objectives, hypothesis, just to force me to clarify my thinking. This is something which I wish I had done in my thesis, as I say, but yeah, alas, such is life. And then I start collecting some research questions in different areas. And you can see here, I've broken them down into 3 different themes. So let me zoom in a bit more. There's theme 1 or theme/topic 1, and then I indent the questions that I'm trying to answer underneath that. Now this here is a page link that I'm using CSS with. I'm not going to go into that. You don't need to use CSS. It's just a helpful visual mechanism again to help you keep track of different pieces of information. And here I could theoretically build out questions underneath that. Question 1.1, question 1.2. I'm not going to number those questions. I'm just saying like it's a subset of question 1. This is an important part here where these list of resources, I collect them in this high-level project page. It's a bit laborious, I'm not going to lie. There must be better ways of doing this. But what it allows me to do is whenever I have a question page that I'm actually then trying to go and write in, I will block embed this question or this theme list of resources into that question page so that it's super easily accessible. I just go click and it opens it over there. As I said, your question pages act as placeholders to synthesize your highlights. I could add hypothetical metadata here where I say this is a type question, and this, I'll speak to this point in the discourse graph later, but you don't need to do that. It's very useful to add that different level of ontology where I say this is how it relates to that thing. Like this is a question, and I could put that supports, opposes, etc. as block properties over here. I could also write them as links in line, which is, I think, a bit more useful to do. Yeah, but don't want to get into that now. And you can see here that I've embedded these PDFs from my high-level question page as a block embed. And that's very, very useful. And yeah, as I say, the synthesis comes later here, where I start composing the different pieces from this question. Now, the beauty is that if I open this question up again in the right-hand sidebar, I've quickly gone to Logseq because I thought it might be useful in this example, but I've got question 1 here that I'm trying to answer, and you can see here that I've got 4 linked references over here. So, how do I actually go and write about this? Well, shift-click over here, and it opens that page up in the right, and I can close all of this, look at the link references, and then start composing that here, but I have the same page open in the right. Very useful feature. As I said, the ability to work in multiple places at once is a real win. Your question pages then acting as placeholders, but when I open up a PDF, as you see, I've just opened up example PDF here, and I'm speaking about annotating PDFs. I have this highlighter button over there, and this is the one that allows me to take a snippet or a picture from my PDF, and those highlights then appear in my PDF annotation page. And the way that I find that annotation page is I go to that button over there. Another important thing to add here, just to smooth your workflows potentially, I've added this highlights page link beneath this the PDF page link. Now, why have I done that? Because when I click on this link over here, it opens it up in the left hand side of the page. It's not taking me to the highlights page immediately. So I have to go click, and then I click there, and that just is a bit labor intensive. So if I just do it once and I add that highlights page over there, it just means I can access it very, very quickly. So yeah, a little bit of a funny workaround. Ideally, this would be something that you can maybe configure later on. Anything here where you have a exclamation mark opens that in Logseq. So I could have an asset file that I bring in, and it's able to open a PNG or an MP3 in Logseq, which is very, very useful. Okay, getting back to Excalidraw. When I start taking notes on this PDF, I don't really have much information about it, and I don't know how I'm going to find that PDF or those annotations again. So what I do is I add metadata to the highlights page itself. That just helps me find that later down the line. So I tag it with an input, or I add a property, page property input PDF, author, Leonardo da Vinci, tag, so I can find it again. I use the cite key. This is an important detail if you want to use it for bibliographies later or for referencing. I use the cite key just because it makes it easier to interchange that with other programs and other users later down the line, but you don't have to do that. I also use the alias or the cite key as an alias, so that if I just click on that page, it brings me to this example PDF immediately, and that's very, very useful. As I said, this is about this is starting from using your PDFs in Logseq, and it's just important to be consistent with that. We're not speaking much about managing your PDFs or managing your sources, but this could be a whole set of videos in and of themselves, and I definitely am not going to make those videos. Okay, so now I have a page with some annotations in Logseq, and you can see that the annotations have this pin over here. So that's why there's that pin over there, and it's just a helpful reminder to see what is actually yours and what is not. And there's so many ways of doing this over here. You could optionally indent underneath a literature link over here, so that you can find this information by saying literature for question 1, etc. But again, personal preference. Adding some tags just make it easier to facilitate search later down the line. Even if you're not adding proper structure, you can at least find different themes of information, hypothetically. And here I say, cool, Donatello make a claim that there's this, and then I say C, generalizable statement alpha made by the authors. And this is supported by evidence A from population sample X. So it's very, very specific. But then I'm saying this is opposed by generalizable statement beta made by the author. And that's in a separate paper now that I've been working on separately. So this enables me to add really nice structure inline. Now there's other ways of doing this. You could use page properties or block properties to define what these relationships are between your different pieces of information. That really is up to you, and if you're working on a collaborative graph or later down the line when that becomes a thing, I think it's going to be important to define those things. I find that writing inline is just very helpful to go on the fly and add the different level of information that I need. I can also break down in the same PDF, I'm trying to answer 2 questions. I can break down the topics or the writing that is linked to that question 1 and writing that is linked to question 2. In this page, I've also got additional context and breakdown. So I could hypothetically put the whole abstract of the paper there if I wanted. I don't think that's very useful. It might mess up my search later down the line. So yeah, especially if you are trying to query text. If you've got too much text from other people, it just becomes a little bit messy, your results. But it's important that I specify the population, the participants, the methods. And here I could add links as well to show all the different papers that I've looked at that are using randomized controlled trials, for instance. So there's so many different ways to put this into your database, and it really is up to you to think about what it is that you are acquiring out of this exercise. So speaking a bit more to those points that I was mentioning here, I just got overexcited and I got into them a little bit earlier. It's splitting workflows and defining relationships. So here I'm separating those questions. Everything is related to question 1 is underneath one block, and everything related to question 2 is underneath another block. Super easy, and that enables you to add this tree of information. Like question 1, I'm dealing with that here. Question 2, I'm dealing with that below. Now, as I said, I'm using inline references to, or inline links to describe these relationships, that's just by indentation. So when I go to generalizable statement alpha made by the authors, let me actually go there now quickly. So close this, generalizable statement alpha made by the authors, I could then filter for what it's supported by. So there we go, supported, boom, supported by. This generalizable statement is supported by this piece of evidence. Let me open this up in the right sidebar. And I can see here when I'm in this page, I can also do it backwards where I can say, okay, this evidence from is supporting this generalizable statement. Great. Now, in future versions or in the future, ideally you'd want that to be able to go both ways, and we'll speak a little bit more to that later. Okay, going back to Excalibur though, I can also define this relationship by double-clicking into a node and using page properties. It's a little bit more complex, but let's have a look at that. So if I go to another example PDF, I have a question that I'm trying to answer, and I have this claim, again, a generalizable statement made by the author. I could then add the metadata, so I'm clicking into that page over here, clicking in, and it's taking me there, and I can add the relationship as page properties. So this opposes evidence D from a population sample Z. Again, this is a lot of manual work up front, so this inline referencing works very nicely, but when it starts to scale, it is not as easily accessible as something which is highly structured, which is accessible from your page properties. So just some things to be aware of when you're doing the trade-offs here. Also, yeah, this is important because there's a plugin being developed, and I'll speak to that later, which will be able to structure and visualize this information very, very well. Representing these relationships diagrammatically, I think, is very useful. So I've got this breakdown over here of question 1 and question 2, and I've got this claim and some evidence and claims over there. So I have got underneath question 1, claim alpha, which is supported by evidence A. I've then got this piece of evidence B, which is floating around yet. It's not connected, and that's over here. You can see there that it's not indented underneath this generalizable statement. It's just indented underneath question 1. But if I go to question 1 page later down the line, I'll be able to find that evidence hypothetically, and I just haven't worked with it yet. Again, it's very fluid, and you need to make preference or provision for the nonlinear dynamic nature of it. Question 2, I have this claim theta. Again, it's not connected, it's over there. It's just floating around. It's indented underneath question 2, but I'll be able to find it later because I've indented properly over there. Okay, but now when I look at these relationships over here, that's like one of the most important things in the synthesis process, where I've said claim alpha is supported by evidence A, and it's opposed by evidence C, and it's opposed by claim beta. So what does that look like over here? Saying here, it's supported by, it's opposed by generalizable statement beta, and it's opposed by evidence C from population sample Y. So yeah, this is probably getting a little bit complex, but when you understand how these different pieces of information relate together, it becomes very powerful later down the line. Moving on, some important points for consideration. And I think this is the beauty of Logseq, but also can be one of the downfalls when using it, is that the tool is not opinionated. You need to define how to use the tool. Structuring your own ontologies and making it work in a way that is effective for you is a difficult process, and it may take some time, but I think it's very useful down the line. Now, this system clearly imposes some upfront costs, but it really promises significant downstream reward. It's like the Zettelkasten approach. It requires a lot of front loading, and the whole idea in the Zettelkasten approach is just in case instead of just in time. Just in time is when you have like a deadline and it's like, I need to do this, and it's a very linear way of working. The just in case is a very divergent, like non-linear way of working. And like, I read this and I take notes on it, and it's like, oh, that stimulates me to read that, and I take notes on that. So I have all these little packets or parcels of knowledge which are coming up to the surface, but then they just almost buried later down, and then later when I want to resurface it, I can find it through tagging or through just search, and there it is, like these little packets of knowledge that I can compose together. Just to add more comments on that, if you're in a full-time research role, this divergent approach of doing the questions and building synthesis is almost part and parcel of the job. I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like there's like a lot more like scope to be broad in your thinking. However, as an undergrad doing a literature survey, and I speak from my personal experience here, so I don't know if it's necessarily the case, but I found that I needed to be a little bit more convergent and like focused in my reading. Otherwise, I would just go anywhere. And yeah, even within this very narrow topic, there's so much to be able, or there's so much out there. So I guess, yeah, as an undergraduate, be careful of going too broad, if that's a thing. And then another point here is that if you're thinking about this in a group context, particularly like in a research lab or something, once the synthesis is done and reviewed by others, so maybe you have some sort of internal peer review, that synthesis can become the basis for a lot of work down the line. So instead of other people having to go and extract pieces of information from PDFs, it's all there available to them. They can track the evidence, they can track where it comes from, they can see what study or what methodology the study used. It becomes very powerful, and this is something that Joel Chan alludes to. So yeah, this is one of his comments, like if I'm right, these sort of notes are more shareable, then I should be able to distribute the process around a team of people. Hopefully this also means we get to substantially reduce the time needed to get or to do effective synthesis. Okay. So I said I wasn't going to speak about referencing or writing, but just a couple of notes that have come up in my process here. Logseq has an integration with Zotero, but it's not necessary to use Zotero. So I know personally people who are using EndNote and Mendeley, and the fact that they don't have the integrations here shouldn't chase you away. You can do absolutely everything in Logseq. I think as long as you're consistent, this is the last point here, this consistency is very important. Obviously you can upload PDFs directly to Logseq and use that as your library. For the people who are going to ask, you can only do that in the desktop application, you cannot do it in the web app. Okay, so whatever you do, ensure consistency. If you're using Zotero, important point here, make sure to remove special characters from your file names. I had some issues with this and I lost a lot of information, but came back down the line and realized that it was because Zotero was storing it in a funny way. Not going to go too much to that, just be consistent. Okay, so notes on the writing process. You can do everything in Logseq, but you may also want to segment some of your workflow in different programs. I mean, there are lots of tools out there, and I remember speaking to Joel, maybe I should just put this over here, and his process for some time was using Rome as a drafting table and then copy pasting that into another program. So there's no hard and fast rules. It'd be amazing if you could do absolutely everything and do the import and export and to LaTeX or whatever feature that you needed. There are some plugins being developed to support different export workflows. I know you can export to Microsoft Word. I made a video on that. I know that there's been some developments on like exporting to PDFs. Yeah. In terms of the process, let me actually just move that down there. This is a work in progress. You eventually want to start creating some information dense pages that you are writing your own words in instead of just like using block reference after block reference. Block references can be a little bit chaotic. They need maintenance. They are great for your earlier stage thinking, but can definitely lead to entropy and chaos over time. So it's important to just switch over at some point to like writing in your own words, and you can still reference those block references, but yeah. The idea about block references is that they become very difficult to export, but you can always convert them to text. Now, the challenge is at some point you are always going to lose that context of being able to drill down into your block. Now, what point do you want to lose that at? When you publish it as a PDF, people aren't going to be able to see your references, your evidence, your claims, etc. At least not yet. Maybe in some idealized version of the future, and maybe I think that's what Logseq is working towards. Who knows? But yeah. That's just one of the trade-offs that you have to think about and something to bear in mind. Okay, so the ongoing work on a discourse graph plugin similar to the Rome plugin. This is what I've been alluding to just in the video, talking about like using page properties or writing about the relationships inline versus like using properties. It's not clear what the right answer is just yet, and like exactly what the discourse graph plugin will use, but it promises a lot of potential. And it's all about allowing you to define those maps or define your ontology up front. So what are your entities and how do they relate to one another? And then how can you display that? So yeah, as I said, it's claims supported by evidence for other claims or opposes evidence for other claims, but that will allow you to visualize those very easily. So that's going to be a big benefit. No promises yet as to when that will be, but I know that there are some people working on that as we speak. So it's likely that this will use page properties from my early understanding of it, and I've watched a couple of videos on it and see the discussions, and that will remove that extraneous work of saying, going into that claim and then creating a page property which says opposes, and then making that other or writing the other claim or evidence there. So ideally that discourse graph will just be like, cool, I have this claim and I want to say it opposes that other claim, and it will do that creation of the page properties and everything for you so that you don't have to worry about that. Another thing that it will ideally have, and I do not know about this for sure, I don't know if it's part of the MVP, but it's a powerful query builder. So datalog queries or datalog queries are extremely powerful in Logseq, but they take very advanced, well, it takes a long time to learn it, and I think only a handful of users are really like extracting the maximum from that. So ideally what this discourse graph will allow you to do is to build your queries visually so that you don't have to know datalog. But again, I don't have any promises. I'm not part of the team working on this. It's just making you aware of some of the things that are going on in the background and that I have done a little bit of research on. Again, I've been working on this for a while, so I'm thinking about like lots of different things that come up and I'm like, should I include them? I'm just including them here in case they apply in your context, but some thoughts about ontologies in different contexts. So in philosophy, claims seem like they could be appropriate. I don't really know too much about like the philosophical process and how one would go about writing that. But what is the evidence that supports a claim? Is it a premise, a presupposition, an axiom? What are those different ontologies that you need to define for yourself? I'd be grateful to hear in the comments if someone's got any good suggestions there. And then for strategy, you can use assertion to replace claims. So typically like how strategy companies or consultants work is they'll have like a primary assertion and then secondary assertions, and that is how they streamline their work. So you can work by assertions and then again define some sort of results or hypothesis. Something that might be important to track is adding assumptions. And yeah, your experiments in this case might be like a prototype or a pilot project, and you get results from that feed into your assertions and say, okay, cool, that was not working the way that we thought, we need to change direction. So yeah, it's all about this like creative knowledge work approach and defining ontologies for that. And the last point there, which I didn't edit properly, is like when strategy consulting firms can work around a single database rather than having to use slides to communicate this, it will become magic. So typically you'll use slides to visually present like how you're working through the problem, whatever. If hypothetically, future case scenario, you have the discourse graph plugin that looks at your hypothesis, all the different work areas that you're working in, and like how different things work together, that'll be amazing. Okay, I had a lot more planned here for looking at different tools, but I think I'll do that in another context. I'll speak to that a little bit later because this video is already getting very long. Very good tools to help you find resources, elicit.org, site.ai. I had another one here which was Research Rabbit. Danny Hatcher does a video on that. I will link to it below. I'll just take a note of that. So yeah, helpful to go and find resources that are referencing your questions. So just some things to conclude with. The diagrams that I use to do the like workflows and show how different things are linked, that'll be available on my Ko-fi page. I'm going to add a minimum payment there, just if it's something that you want, just to recognize the work that went into that. If you'd like to learn Logseq, then I'd highly recommend you look at logseqmastery.com. Logseq Mastery is the course that I put together to synthesize and condense all that I've learned in the, what is it now, 18 plus months of using Logseq and all the ways of working. And I've really made it a structured approach to learning Logseq, so you don't have to go through hundreds of YouTube tutorials. It really is a beginner's to master's guide. The idea is that you can leapfrog or exclude a whole bunch of this learning process that so many people who use Logseq have had to suffer through, and yeah, just hit the ground running with whatever it is that you're working on. I'm going to add some companion videos to this video in Logseq Mastery. Eventually I'll make a nice cleaned up version of this in Logseq Mastery too, but there'll be some companion videos there showing my behind the scenes working with how I'm working with or how I was editing my own thesis from back in the day, and just looking at some new questions just to make sure this approach was scalable and consistent. I'd really like to give a huge thanks to Joel Chan. Firstly, it was his video with Robert Haysfield on how to do knowledge synthesis in Rome that got me so interested in structuring different ways of working in these tools for thought. He really is a leader in this field, and I highly recommend you go check out some of his work on Oasis Lab and also some of the work that he did with Robert Haysfield and Brendan Langan, and that was for the project Scaling Synthesis. This whole idea of collective knowledge management and working in collective discourse graphs is going to be a big thing going forward. It's my strong bet, and these guys are really some of the names that are shaping how that will work. So definitely go have a look at that. And yeah, thanks to Joel and for Robert for introducing me to Joel via that video. And then also thank you to my sister. She's a professor who had to sit through my early draft and was like, whoa, this is not working at all. Like, I've never looked at Logseq. I'm still trying to convince her to use Logseq, but yeah, we'll get there. And yeah, so massive thanks to her for making sure that I took the right direction with this video, I hope. So that's it from me. I really hope that you found this useful, and I really hope that Logseq can help you make sense of whatever it is you're trying to do in your research or in other workflows, and that this video might have given you some ideas or ways to approach things that would be a big win. Thanks so much for your attention. Cheers.